Addiction of gambling. 99% of all gamblers do not stop before they win big, independent of what the internet tells you. Instead, casinos and other companies can fool those among the most intricate objects in the world into one more spin: your brain. Fascinatingly enough, gambling alters the brain in a manner akin to those of drug addicts. Like drugs, gambling releases dopamine and other neurotransmitters linked with pleasure and reinforcement, therefore activating the reward system of the brain. Dopamine release from the excitement of taking chances and the hope of winning help the brain to experience gratification. The brain gets conditioned over time to search for and demand the dopamine surge connected with gambling, which causes obsessive behavior. Though it may be difficult for you to picture, in the imagination of a gambler, sitting in front of a slot machine, running the lever repeatedly brings the most pleasure. One gets a surge of expectation every time the reels spin. Is this the major prize? The expectancy sets off dopamine release in the brain. The near miss, in which the symbols on the reels almost line up to form a winning combination, nevertheless triggers the dopamine system even if the player loses, therefore keeping them hooked and ready to play once more. As the gambler keeps on, their brain alters over time. The reward system's continuous stimulation might cause desensitization, in which case the same degree of pleasure requires more massive rewards. This helps build tolerance, in which the person must bet more often or with greater stakes to feel the same great he once did. Starting as a $100 wager practically immediately ends up being $10,000 on black. Since, strangely enough, the brain has almost limitless supply of these joyful chemicals, so there is no risk addicts will miss to obtain just another high. The adrenaline that losing money on bets generates makes your brain happy and drives you to want to gamble more even if you are losing. Addiction from religion. Most of the time, for many people, religious and spiritual beliefs can give them community and direction. Extreme attention to religious practices can, however, occasionally become harmful. Someone who is overly entwined in their religious practices may ignore important chores or homework to concentrate on religion, see everything as just right or wrong with no in-between, get quite agitated if they cannot perform their religious rites, and only hang out with others from their religious group. The behavior itself does not entail drug intake, which distinguishes religious addiction from other forms of addiction. But comparable emotions can be triggered by the obsessive urge to methodically engage in specific religious activities in order to reach a condition of emotional comfort or perceived highs. Unlike drugs or alcohol, which one can cease totally, complete abstinence is usually not a desired or practical alternative for religion. This makes religious addictions like behavioral addictions like gambling or sex addiction comparable in nature, where moderation is the aim rather than only avoidance. Unbelievably true, some people become so engrossed in religious practices that they begin to feel bodily sensations like warmth or tingling during prayer or meditation, as though their body is reacting to their spiritual experience. Pee addiction. Some of these addicts begin their journey innocently enough, staring at a few periodicals and photos. They might find themselves constantly driven to view pee stuff, totally irresistible. Looking at pee material triggers the portion of your brain linked with pleasure and reinforcement. Like in cases of drug addictions, the new experience and thrill connected with pee can produce a strong reward reaction in the brain. You see, our brains were not developed to have instantaneous access to so much information. Comparatively to what is accessible today, our primate-like brains were subjected to rather low stimulation throughout evolutionary times. Our ancestors most certainly experienced sexual stimuli in the context of real-life interactions. Thus, you would have to speak with someone of your attracted gender to get any kind of stimulus, which might have been more predictable and less varied than the spectrum of material available in pee today. Watching pee is like watching a young child at a candy store with free will to have as much as it wants. Like a child, it's amazing at first, but with time, negative things are sure to happen to the mind using a limitless library of stuff at disposal. Pee frequent exposure over time can cause desensitization, in which case the brain loses responsiveness to the same stimuli. People seeking more extreme or powerful kinds of pee to reach the same degree of arousal and dopamine release tolerance may be desensitizing themselves. Alcohol dependency. Given that your liver can sometimes withstand more than 30 years of misuse before it gives up, and considering how readily available most alcohol is, it should not be surprising that this is among the most widespread addictions in the whole world. People grow tolerant to alcohol with time, thus they must drink ever more important quantities to have the intended benefits. Many alcoholics believe that discontinuing their drink causes more harm than benefits. This is perhaps paradoxically true in some sense, as when alcohol intake is cut or stopped, people may suffer from withdrawal symptoms like tremor, nausea, sweating, anxiety, insomnia, and occasionally seizures or delirium tremens, DTs. Usually a medical emergency, DTs usually strike 48 to 96 hours after the last drink and cause symptoms including extreme confusion, disorientation, and hallucinations. Self-harming. At first, self-harm might trigger the brain's regular opioid system, your natural painkillers, which releases endorphins, the body's natural analgesics. As the pain and emotional suffering that brought about are momentarily relieved, this might lead to either temporary comfort or pleasure. The brain is programmed to arrange pain from A to Z, so depending on its degree, it is higher up on the list and the original pain is typically diminished. Like other addictions, your brain gets used to the chemical changes linked with self-harm, and people may acquire tolerance, therefore more frequent or severe self-harm may be needed to reach the same degree of relief or bliss. Furthermore, connected with other negative coping mechanisms and emotional control techniques is self-harm. People who struggle with extreme emotions such as anxiety, depression, or trauma-related suffering may turn to self-harm as a form of control. Therefore, in a sad turn of events, self-harm could offer a little solace from emotional suffering or a sense of control in cases when people feel helpless. Every time the person experiences any kind of stress, the body will naturally yearn for the pain in order to release endorphins. People withdrawing from self-harm may have a variety of physical and psychological symptoms. Physically, people whose self-injury could feel uncomfortable or hurt where it happened. The natural painkillers their bodies release help some people genuinely feel peaceful and relieved after injuring themselves. Psychologically, stopping self-harm might be difficult since people might struggle to manage great emotional pain without their habitual coping strategy. Please speak to someone and get help if you ever feel depressed or as though there is nowhere to turn. Never the right choice is self-harm. Drug dependency. Some medications have the not-so-fun capacity to seize the brain's normal reward circuits, which are usually triggered by healthy activities include eating, drinking, and sex. And when taken, they produce a surge of dopamine, a brain chemical linked with pleasure and reward, which causes great delight. The brain changes over time to accommodate these substances, losing sensitivity to natural rewards and hence supporting the compulsive drug-seeking behavior. This replaces the same delight you would have experienced from embracing a loved one or dining with the strong need to use the medication. Particularly in regions related to decision-making, self-control, and behavior regulation, your consistent drug use causes changes in the structure and function of the brain. These modifications make it more difficult for people, even with unfavorable consequences, to fight drug urges and stop taking drugs. The brain's capacity to feel pleasure from natural rewards is much diminished, which emphasizes even more the requirement of medicines in reaching a feeling of well-being. The brain becomes so reliant on the effects these medications have struggled to function regularly without them. Hence, during withdrawal, it struggles to resume its normal functioning and often causes great discomfort and a strong need to use the drug again to minimize the symptoms. Now, because your brain's reward and stress signals are so distorted during withdrawal, cravings, mood problems, and a higher likelihood of relapse follow from. Addictions to food. Although the meal itself is not an addictive substance, the brain's reaction to some kinds of very tasty and rewarding foods can be just as strong. Addiction to food. Foods heavy in sugar, fat, and salt cause the brain to link them with strong sensations of pleasure and satisfaction, therefore triggering cravings and compulsive eating patterns. Even when they are not physically hungry, those with food addictions may have strong cravings and an irresistible need to eat particular foods. The reward system of the brain becomes aberrant, so people could give food first priority above other obligations or activities. Eating satisfying foods can bring great pleasure and satisfaction that can be a strong motivator, causing a cycle of cravings and overindulgence. Emotional elements like stress, anxiety, or despair can tip them over to a point where even the smallest bit of tension can lead addicts to engage in food-related frenzy. Like other addicts, they can lack awareness of a problem with their behaviors. When you try to change or limit their eating patterns, they could go through irritation, worry, despair, tiredness, and strong cravings for the foods they have been overindulging in. These are symptoms reminiscent of those of a substance addiction. Addiction for plastic surgery. This frequently occurs when a person with body dysmorphia visits plastic surgery. Even after several cosmetic enhancing operations, it is never quite adequate. Their nose would be barely off to the left, and their eyebrow would be too high or low. Though they might or might not loathe themselves, they will constantly believe that more could be done in an endless loop to obtain the ideal appearance. Even the simple expectation of bettering one's appearance by cosmetic surgery can cause the brain to flood in joyful hormones. Paradoxically, the brain may start to link cosmetic operations with sensations of satisfaction and self-confidence, therefore boosting the want for more operations. Those with plastic surgery addiction may withdraw and become unstable when unable to get cosmetic operations. Fascinatingly enough, though, people with plastic surgery addiction may never feel completely happy with their appearance even after several cosmetic surgeries. They might keep pointing out fresh areas they believe need work, which fuels a cycle of operations and discontent that leaves them in never-ending self-loathing. Extremely rare occurrences have seen some people attempt to surgically transform themselves into dolls or imaginary characters. It reveals the degree of their obsession with appearances. Addiction within relationships. Someone who develops codependency addiction neglects their own needs and identity in favor of a relationship. Deriving self-worth from sacrificing for and caring for their relationship drives the compulsion in addiction. Instead of pursuing fresh romantic highs, codependents remain profoundly dependent, even in toxic relationships. They struggle to set limits and give themselves top priority. Their whole feeling of validation and direction comes from their need for their spouse. Some persons with relationship addiction may begin closely matching their partner's preferences, dislikes, and even mannerisms, as though they are attempting to be their clone to create the ideal connection. It's like duplicating someone's homework. You believe it's the only way you'll earn a decent mark. Usually driven by childhood events, this addiction emerges from attempts to mend anxieties and abandonment fears rather than from pleasure-seeking. Losing their feeling of autonomy in the process, codependent people obsessively put others first. They receive the hit from meeting their needs and getting any scrap of affection or gratitude in return. This strengthens the imbalanced, unhealthy cycle of self-neglect.